today is a pivotal day for Joe Biden, the candidate. Next hour, the president will leave the White House for an afternoon campaign event in Wisconsin, and it is there where he will sit down with ABC's George Stephanopoulos for an interview that could decide whether his reelection can survive. This will be his first television interview since the CNN debate, when his many stumbles and stammers raised serious questions inside his own party about his ability to lead for 4 more years. Wary Americans will be closely scrutinizing everything he says and does and how he does it, with one lost thought potentially ending his campaign. But Biden is digging in, insisting he is not dropping out.
This could not be done without the family support. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We love you, and I really mean it from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. Thank you. You got me, man. I'm not going anywhere. All right.
I'm not going anywhere, he says. So let's go to the White House. CNN's Priscilla Alvarez. Priscilla, I understand you have new reporting just in about how the White House, how the Biden team is viewing this interview tonight.
Look, Jim, this is going to be a high-stakes moment for President Biden as he tries to reassure allies and voters through this primetime interview. Biden campaign officials tell me they recognize that, but they also note and are managing expectations with the president's verbal missteps. He is prone to those. He has talked about that before, noting that he has taken efforts to overcome his childhood stutter. So at times that is what is coming through, and there has been pushback as well over the last several days from the Biden campaign when there is a magnification of those verbal missteps, with one spokesperson saying that it is, quote, not news and, quote, past the point of absurdity. But what is the point here, Jim, is that while what the president says in this interview is going to be important, it's also the delivery of how he says it, to try in hopes that he can show that reassurance by also demonstrating that vigor and aggressiveness that allies, or rather I should say officials and advisors, say they see behind the scenes.
Priscilla, this morning Biden's campaign announced what they described as an aggressive travel schedule. That said, it's CNN's reporting the president intends to stop scheduling events after 8 p.m. so he could get more rest. This apparently part of his message to Democratic governors when he met with them at the White House. Tell us what the actual strategy is in your reporting.
Well, in some ways, Jim, this is the campaign telling allies, we hear you. Of course, we have heard over the last several days that they want to see the president have more unscripted moments. They want to see him on the campaign trail, engaging with voters often to, again, demonstrate that the president is up to the job. And so this is a campaign memo that tries to outline how they're going to do that with, quote, an aggressive travel schedule. That includes the president, the vice president, the first lady, the second gentleman collectively going to every battleground state. The president also going to Nevada to talk at 2 conferences targeting Black and Latino voters, and the conventional methods of a $50 million paid media blitz. So certainly taken together, you can see how the campaign is trying to use momentum or gain momentum going into the next few months after a very challenging week. And you heard from the president himself yesterday that he's not going anywhere. But I should also note, Jim, that during that July 4th celebration, he was joined with Vice President Kamala Harris. She has not been observing the fireworks from the balcony with the president before, typically engaging in other July 4th celebrations. So that moment in and of itself appeared to be a show of unity as they both face multiple pressing questions about the trajectory of the race and President Biden's viability as a candidate.
Yeah, his closeness to the vice president certainly going to be can attract a lot of attention given the open discussions behind the scenes about options going forward. Priscilla Alvarez at the White House, thanks so much. So let's continue this conversation. Joining us now, Brian Stelter, CNN's former chief media correspondent, now a special correspondent for Vanity Fair. Brian, good to have you on. And this morning you wrote a piece for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution with a different focus for this debate, and that is George Stephanopoulos, and that he will be watched, as the headline says there, as much as Joe Biden. Quoting you, the longtime journalist and former Politico has been on both sides of a crisis. Tell us what the stakes are here. I imagine he will be judged in large part based on how much he pushes to some degree.
Yes, because today George Stephanopoulos is all of us. He's every journalist in the country. He's also many voters who want answers from this president. Astoundingly, Jim, the White House is almost portraying this interview as a cognitive test, like it's some sort of televised doctor's appointment. The White House and the Biden campaign have raised the stakes for this interview as if it was not already important enough. So it is both the most important interview of the interviewer's career, Stephanopoulos, but most importantly, for Biden. As you said, his presidency is on the line here. And yet at the same time, it's only one interview. It's not nearly enough compared to what Biden has to do more broadly to prove to the country that he's fit for service.
Listen, it's an interview. It's not a debate. And part of the issue with the debate, right, was the split screen. And trust me, I'm not discounting the many lies Trump told in that debate, but in terms of quickness, sharpness, et cetera, even as Trump was delivering many lies, it was that contrast that was part of the problem. So, I mean, there are some things that this interview will never solve.
No, George Stephanopoulos' former boss, Bill Clinton, used to say, strong and wrong always beats weak and right. That's what we saw at the debate last week. And now the fallout is tremendous, and a single interview can't change that. I know this is a frustrating story for many viewers because the public-facing story is so different from the private story. In private, Democrats are panicking. Governors, lawmakers, even Biden allies and aides and donors, all privately panicking. And yet in public, some of them are still supporting the president. You know, governors, for example, were saying they support him after that meeting, but then they privately leaked their concerns. Unfortunately, though, this is the reality. This is how the political world works. People are more honest in private than they are in public. And in private, they're saying this president has to go. Why hasn't he held a news conference? Why isn't he doing that today? You know, Darlene Ferrero in 1984, when she was the VP nominee with Walter Mondale, she was in a political crisis. And she had a 2-hour-long press conference with 200 reporters trying to prove that she could take on any question. Of course, the candidacy ultimately lost. We know Mondale lost in a landslide anyway. But that idea of a massive press conference, those are the sorts of things we haven't even seen the Biden campaign admit to thinking about in the past week.
You know, it's interesting that the disconnect between the private and the public conversation regarding Biden is not unlike the difference we saw between the private and public conversation about Trump, right? Privately, many Republicans would say he can't be the candidate, damaging, et cetera, but they wouldn't say that publicly. Loyalty to party, fears about their own political futures. I mean, all these factors play a part. I want to show you a cover, the British magazine, The Economist here. It mocks Biden with well, there's a walker there, no way to run a country, deliberate reference to age. You're closely following the media coverage of this story, and let's be frank, it's not just national, it is international. Overall, what's your assessment of it over the last week?
I think before the last week, voters were ahead of the media on this. What I mean is that voters had already decided, most voters, that Biden was too old to be president for 4 more years. But now the elite media is ahead of the Democratic base. The elite media, like The Economist, calling on Biden to resign. All this talk about a Kamala Harris presidency. Look, Jim, we may be in a world where we're going to have the first female president in the United States in a matter of weeks. That is not impossible. It seemed crazy maybe a couple of weeks ago before the debate. But we are now in an environment where there are a lot of possibilities. I think that points to the asymmetry of these two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans are backing their convicted felon candidate to the hilt. Democrats are having a very active conversation about throwing their guy overboard. These two parties are so different. They're not the same. There's an asymmetry here. And you're seeing that in the media coverage as well, where liberal-leaning outlets are pressing for Biden to go because they believe that's the way to stop Trump. At the end of the day, this entire conversation about Biden is actually a conversation about Donald Trump.
True. And you did not have a similar conversation in right-wing media or at least publicly from Republican lawmakers following Donald Trump's criminal convictions right here in New York, which of course raised its own questions. Brian Stelter.
And by the way, imagine if Kamala Harris becomes the candidate, Trump is suddenly the old one. Trump is suddenly the one that can't be trusted on stage because he's full of word vomit. Yeah, I was at a 4th of July parade yesterday, Jim. There were very few Biden signs. There were very few Trump signs. It was mostly just people who are tired of this kind of politics. They want to change. They want newer, younger faces.
I saw similar watching the fireworks last night as well.
Yeah.
Brian Stelter, thanks so much.